Okay, so early in the week, we covered the first of the 3 pictorials. We talked about isometrics, we talked about obliques, and today we're going to cover perspectives, which is the third, the most realistic, but also maybe the most tricky of the pictorials to create. So a perspective drawing is going to offer the most realistic 3-dimensional view, like I mentioned, because it portrays the object in a manner that is most similar to the way that we perceive the visual world, meaning that as something gets farther away from us, it appears to trail off towards a vanishing point. There are 3 types of perspective drawings. We're going to cover 1 and 2-point with examples of how to create those. The 3-point perspective we'll just kind of mention. We won't actually do any of those in the activity either. So we're going to start with the 1-point perspective first. It is probably the simplest to make of the 3. However, it's a little bit awkward in appearance when comparison to other types of pictorials. It's going to resemble an oblique in the sense that the front view is flat and then we have depth in one direction. But instead of the lines being parallel like an oblique, these are going to trail off to a vanishing point. So one vanishing point is identified at a horizon line, and then a series of lines from this object would trail to that point. So let's talk about 2 different methods for creating this same puzzle cube piece as a 1-point perspective. First method is going to be using the box method, like we talked about for our isometric drawings and for our oblique drawings. So with the box method, I'm going to draw a horizontal line across the upper part of the paper, and it's going to represent the horizon, along with 1 vanishing point. So I've identified a vanishing point on the line. The placement of this vanishing point is arbitrary, meaning that I could move this anywhere on the line and I could still create a 1-point perspective. Next, I'm going to sketch the front face of the box representing the overall size of the object. The front face is constructed with vertical height lines and horizontal width lines. So if this is the object that I'm using, I have a width of 3 units, a height of 2, and a depth of 2. So when I create my box, I'm interested in height and the width. It looks like they've doubled the number. So grid spacing wise, I've doubled the number. I have 3 units wide and 2 units tall to represent the front of the box that this object would fit into. Then I'm going to use construction lines, and it's really important with perspectives that your construction lines are as light as possible because of the fact that there's going to be quite a few of them. And so the lighter that these construction lines can be, the better. And in these PowerPoints, the red lines represents construction. So from each of the corners then, I'm going to draw lines back to my vanishing point. This is to set the depth for my box. Next step is the trickiest. This is where I have to estimate where the depth is, how far back there is. There is no grid that's going to allow me to know what that measurement is, because notice that each of these lines is different as far as the angle they're at. And so I have no way of counting the depth using the grid on my paper, so I have to estimate. So in this case, for depth, I'm estimating that this is how far back 2 units is for this object. If my estimate were off, meaning I would estimate that it's much farther down, it would not make the perspective drawing incorrect. It would just look a little bit more skewed or stretched out than the actual object. So the better the estimate, the more realistic your perspective is going to look. So I've estimated the depth for this object, and this is the box then, the top, the front, and the right side view of the box that this object would fit into. Now, like we did with the isometrics and oblique, I want to identify the surfaces of this object that would touch the surfaces of the box that I'm drawing on. So starting with the front view, this surface is touching this part of the box, and then I'm going to bring this corner back to my vanishing point. Same with the top. This is the top touching the box, and then the right-hand view. Notice that anything related to depth goes back to my vanishing point. So my vertical, horizontal lines, and then anything relating to depth goes back to the vanishing point. I'm going to darken these in with object lines because I know it'll be part of the final drawing. And then I'm going to worry about the interior surfaces, meaning what's inside the box for my object. And this is where we get a lot of our construction lines. So again, the lighter, the better for this. So I'm pulling each of these corners back to my vanishing point. I need to add my horizontal lines and vertical lines. And I'm going to darken in the finished ones with object lines. So the part that's going to be part of the final drawing is going to get darkened in with my object lines. Last step would be to add tonal shading. And the tonal shading, again, is going to make this look a little bit more realistic. Okay, so this is method number one, box method. Lots of construction lines in this method, but that is the process. Okay. Second method would be to deal with individual surfaces rather than the entire box at one time. So again, I'll put my horizontal line to represent my horizon, and I'll pick where the vanishing point's going to go. Then I'm just going to concern myself with this front surface. So this one individual face is going to be the starting point for my drawing. In this case, I did it with object lines because I know it'll be part of the final drawing. Each of these corners then I'm going to take back towards the vanishing line. And then I need to estimate the depth, not of the entire object, but the depth from this surface to the next plane or next surface. So that's 1 unit back. So I estimate that to be the depth for those. I'm darkening that in with my object lines. So I'm only focusing on this individual cube rather than the entire object in this case. Now I need to complete the next plane. So there's a cube that sits on top of that one. Each of those trails back to the vanishing point. And then the cubes that sit to the side or to the right. So rather than dealing with the entire surface or the entire object at one time, I'm doing individual surfaces and working my way back. The benefit to doing it this way is there's fewer construction lines, right? A lot fewer construction lines. However, we have to do a good job of estimating our depth because we have to do it more than once for this object, right? So there's kind of benefits and there's things that are tricky about doing it this way. Okay, so that would be the two methods of creating the same object as a one-point perspective. This is going to resemble an oblique in the sense that the front view or the front surface is flat on this object. We can add the tonal shading on here. It's going to make it look a little bit more realistic, and that's something I'll have you guys do on the activity that we start today. So that's a one-point perspective, and that's the process for doing that. Here's some great examples of one-point perspectives. Notice that the vanishing point in this case is on the center of the horizon line, and it works just fine. And as I move this vanishing point, it's going to change the appearance of the object that I'm looking at. Let's talk about a two-point perspective then. This is going to be the most common one, and it's going to be fairly similar and look similar to what an isometric pictorial looks like. The only difference in this case is that each of the lines here is at a different angle rather than all being exactly 30 degrees like they were on the isometric. So the following slides then will be the steps for creating this object as a two-point perspective. On the activity that we're starting today, this object is one of the ones that we have to draw, and so you can use this portion of the slides as a step-by-step example for completing that drawing in the activity. So we'll start with our horizon line. Because it's a two-point perspective, now I have two vanishing points. Okay. Now instead of starting with a flat surface like the front view of the object like I did for a one-point perspective, I'm interested in this front edge, just like we talked about with isometrics. The front edge where the top, the front, and the right view meet. And so I'm interested in this front edge, so I'm going to draw this line. It's a light construction line on my paper. This line could move around, right? It could be closer to the second vanishing point of the first, so the placement of this is a little bit arbitrary. If I want to create the box based on this front edge, I have to estimate what the height is of this front edge, which I know is 2 units tall, and transfer that to my line, right? So this height gets transferred to my line, and then each of those points will be taken back to each of the two vanishing points. Okay, so I've done the front edge of my box. Now I have to estimate the width and the depth for my object, and just like a one-point perspective, the better the estimate, the more realistic your drawing is going to be. It won't be incorrect. We could make it even if the estimate is way off, but it's going to look a little skewed. So I'm estimating that this would be the depth for my object. This is going to represent my 3 units in depth, and then I'm going to estimate that this is my width for the object. I will pull each of those points back to the vanishing point, and that creates the box that this object is going to fit into. Just like all of the other pictorials we've done with the box method, now I want to identify the surfaces. Like in this case, this surface is going to touch this surface of the box. I want to identify that on the drawing. Do the same thing for each of the two front surfaces that are touching the box. And then finally the top, this square sits in the middle up top here. And I'm using my vanishing points to set the depth for these objects. Now I want to darken each of these in. I know it's going to be part of the final drawing, so I'll go ahead and darken those in. I'm using nice dark object lines. Now again, I need to deal with the interior faces and surfaces. Pulling my lines back to my vanishing points. And when I'm done, I can darken each of these in to complete the drawing. Tonal shading is the last step. And again, this specific drawing, this object will be one that we do in the activity that we start today. So I would encourage you to use these slides as a reference for doing that drawing. So here's a great example of in this case, a printer drawn as a 2-point perspective. And then finally, we're just going to mention the 3-point perspective. They do exist. This is going to be your worm's eye or bird's eye view of an object. And the only difference between, let's say, the 2-point and the 3-point perspective is we now have a vanishing point that sits below the object. And with that vanishing point, all of our lines, instead of being completely vertical like they've been in the two previous examples, all my vertical lines now trail down to this third vanishing point. The process is pretty much the same as a 2-point perspective, except we now have a vanishing point underneath the object. So let's look at how similar a perspective versus an isometric is, and how to identify the differences between the two. And how do I know which of these is perspective and which one is isometric? So I'm saying this is perspective and this is the isometric, but why? What's the difference between the two? If I add lines to the edges of this object, I notice that in my perspective, that these lines are getting closer and closer together, like they're converging on a vanishing point. As compared to my isometric, where the lines stay parallel. Same with these other lines, like they're going to a vanishing point as opposed to staying parallel. Okay, so to identify the difference between perspective has to do with whether or not our lines are going to trail off to a vanishing point. Let's talk about today's activity. We're starting 2.2 perspective sketching, and there are 4 drawings that you're going to complete. It's the same 2 objects drawn 2 different ways. Once as a 1-point perspective and once as a 2-point perspective. So for number 1 and for number 2, this is the object that we are drawing. A lot of people get confused and they think, well, these are 2 separate objects. This is the same object. It's just been rotated from this view 90 degrees to see the other side. Right? These are not 2 separate objects. So when I start with this number 1, I want to do a 1-point perspective of this object. Remember that for 1-point perspectives, the box method that we use, the front view of this object is completely flat. So I would draw the front of the box. Each of those corners would come back to my vanishing point. So for number 1, it's this object as a 1-point perspective. For number 2, it's that same object, but now drawn as a 2-point perspective. So instead of dealing with this front face being completely flat, we're dealing with the front edge, which will then trail off to our 2 vanishing points. Drawing 3 and 4 are based on this object. First as a 1-point perspective, and then again as a 2-point perspective, which was the example that we did in this PowerPoint. So when you get to number 4, I would encourage you to go back to the PowerPoint and use that as a reference as you're completing the drawing. Below that, we have the 3 conclusion questions. This is something that can be filled out in the Word document, or if you want to put it directly in the notebook, you can do that as well. We're going to spend several days working on this. I would encourage you to do maybe 2 drawings per page. So if I put a horizon line at the top of the page and a horizon line at the midpoint of the page, you could fit a 1-point and then a 2-point perspective below that. I do have rulers that you're more than welcome to use. In fact, I would encourage you to use because of the number of lines that are going to go back to the vanishing point. Once you finish the drawings, and the conclusion questions, I'll have you turn those both in to 2.2 on the LMS.